How's it sound? We good? Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I want to start off, we're here to talk about the wrap up of the 24 session. I want to start by thanking and congratulating lawmakers on a very productive session, one that was focused on bipartisan successes. When it came to the top of mind issues for Oregonians, legislators came together and they got the work done. So I'm going to talk first about housing and homelessness for the session. At the top of my list for the session was housing production. Oregonians in every part of the state are straining under the pressure of an unaffordable housing market, mostly driven by inadequate supply. I was very clear before session, and we've talked about it, that it was imperative that the legislature make significant movement this year on addressing the state's undersupply of housing. My one bill for the session on housing production, Senate Bill 1537, along with a companion spending bill, Senate Bill 1530, passed with strong bipartisan support. The work is not done. It never is, but I'm pleased with a solid start to the work ahead of us. I really do appreciate the Democrats and Republicans who worked hard to get the emergency housing stabilization and production package completed in the session. As well as, I'm very thankful for the months of collaboration between the housing developers, the affordable housing organizations, the cities, the conservation groups, and many others who came together to make sure the package could be refined and could do the job. Here's the bottom line. And now, because of the bills, Oregon will have more tools to meet the urgent demand for all types of housing in all parts of the state. And the option for certain cities to expand their urban growth boundaries for housing, which comes with the strongest affordability requirements in the country. You all know that the housing shortages we have here in Oregon have been in the making for decades. I'm encouraged by the progress that we made this year. And I'm looking forward to leading discussions throughout this year, going into next year's session, about how we can work on standing up ongoing programs to support the housing production, not only for the years ahead, but in decades ahead. We must maintain the bipartisan momentum on housing that came together in the session. And we have to be focused on the results of the work in the session. So in that vein, my administration will be closely tracking the infrastructure funding that has been directly allocated to cities and other organizations across the state to ensure that they are spent accountably and are actually advancing the housing production that they are intended to do. More housing is the long-term solution for our homelessness crisis. But we also have to continue to forge ahead on meeting the needs of people who are living outside right now. That's why I appreciate that the legislature also allocated $65 million toward maintaining our emergency shelter capacity and $41 million for ongoing eviction prevention work. When I signed the emergency order back in January of this year to extend the homelessness state of emergency for another year, I said we would be back on announcing the specific goals for the year 2 of that emergency. We will have those out shortly. We still need to maintain the new added capacity to the state shelter system, rehouse people experiencing homelessness, and prevent homelessness in the first place. So stay tuned for the next update on those goals for the second year of the emergency declaration. So let's move to education for the session. As you know, education is a key priority for my administration. We've been working hard since the last session to implement the early literacy grants in the Department of Education. But I also felt that this session needed to do more to support summer learning opportunities for our students this coming summer. We know that too many students are behind academically in the wake of the pandemic, and the evidence is clear that summer learning reduces learning loss between our school years, accelerates academic achievement, and strengthens student well-being. With the summer learning investment, we will be able to really focus on success for our students who need learning recovery this summer by providing more options to learn. Initial estimates indicate that the $30 million for summer learning that was in House Bill 4082 will benefit between 18,000 and 24,000 students across the state in the coming months. I know that districts and community partners are ready to do the work and are excited about the resources. Additionally, in the bill, House Bill 4082, it calls for a discussion about creating an Oregon 21st Century Community Learning Center initiative to address education disparities through increased summer and after-school learning opportunities. I anticipate this topic will be a cornerstone of my education goals for the 2025 session. I want to talk about 3 other investments that were in this year's session for the Oregon Department of Education. The first one is $2.2 million to develop and maintain publicly accessible data dashboards featuring school district financial data. This follows through on a commitment I made last year following the resolution of the strike of Portland Public Schools to make budget information from school districts more accessible and easier to understand. I anticipate that data will be online by the end of the year. The second investment is $2 million to address a backlog of discrimination complaints at our schools and to provide parent advocates for families who are navigating district and state level complaint processes. We need to get through that backlog. The third investment is $2 million to improve public awareness among students about the dangers of fentanyl and other deadly drugs. We anticipate that will be helpful in our youth prevention work throughout the year. All these critical investments are really dedicated to supporting our students, and I want to thank the legislature for prioritizing those dollars. Let's move on to another topic of the session, which was the addiction crisis. Legislators knew that they needed to come into session and figure some things out as they relate to our addiction crisis. And their work was focused on the Joint Committee on Addiction and Community Safety, specifically related to any adjustments in Measure 110. In our conversations, I have been very consistent that I would review those policy proposals and the budget investments from the Joint Committee as a comprehensive package. And I've already stated since the session that I intend to sign House Bill 4002 and the related prevention and treatment investments in House Bill 5204. The legislature's work this session is but one step in making sure we help Oregonians suffering from addiction while also ensuring community safety. I share the concerns of many Oregonians that the projected disparate impacts to Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Oregon because of the changes, and they were outlined by the Criminal Justice Commission in the requested racial equity impact statement, which accompanied House Bill 4002. That is why, because of those concerns, that I've directed my administration to work closely with each of the implementing authorities, the courts, the Oregon Judicial Department, the Oregon Public Defense Commission, the cities, the counties, law enforcement, DAs, to set expectations to mitigate projected impacts to communities of color and ensure that treatment pathways for individuals, which is one of the goals, are balanced with the accountability outcomes related to the criminal justice system. And before I take questions, I'd like to conclude my remarks by lifting up the historic step that the legislature took this session in passing campaign finance reform. For decades, Oregonians have clearly expressed the desire for change. Change can be difficult. And certainly I did not start this year with optimism that we would be able to find a compromise in the session. But as progress was made in the final weeks of session, I really appreciated the productive conversations that were being led by now Speaker Julie Fahey. We were trying really hard to get that bill over the finish line. I wanted to see a plan passed in the session so we could get started on campaign limits in a thoughtful fashion. And I was clear to everybody involved that this was a time to actually get it done. So I want to applaud all the groups that came together, business, labor, good government groups, to deliver the changes that will strengthen transparency and confidence in Oregon's election system. I want to thank the legislative leadership for their commitment and urgency in what was a very busy session to get the right policy done this session so we could prevent a divisive fight at the ballot in November. We now have a pathway to campaign finance reform that I think is good for our state, and I really want to thank people for getting that done. Because this is how Oregon should be solving problems. Bipartisan fashion on issues that matter to Oregonians and getting it done in a way that we can now implement. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Governor, you were really clear before the session as pertains to Measure 110. You were looking for a balance, right? Treatment, but also recriminalization could be part of it. It's not just sort of the disparities that we've learned about what we might expect from this. It's thousands of people convicted every year. The CJC doesn't think many of them will even be offered the the option for conditional discharge, which is how they would have their charges dismissed by completing treatment, hundreds of people in jail. When you look at those numbers, I mean, how do you square that with the balance you were trying to strike? Because I think in some people's mind, it feels very much like it will just be a return to 2019. So how are you thinking about it?
Well, what I could say for what the legislature came up with, it's not where we were before Measure 110. I think it's a different approach, and the amount of investments they are putting into what they are calling deflection for those initial contacts that people are having with local law enforcement, that they do result in better pathways to get connected to services. What we see in 4002 is an attempt to say, this is still a public health emergency. I think that's what Oregonians believe. And there are some people who believe that some connection with local law enforcement is a helpful motivator for some folks to get into treatment. I think what you see in the bill is an attempt to say, if that is true, let's make sure folks are getting to treatment. I can't speak to the numbers of folks who are incarcerated now. I mean, many of those folks have multiple issues and are not just about possession, which is what the misdemeanor is about. But what I'm focused on right now is making sure we can get that balance. We're trying to figure out right now how we communicate with all the partners involved at the local level. Because again, this is all implemented at the local level. Local courts, local law enforcement, local treatment providers. We want to have consistency across the state. We want to set some goals and expectations about what that looks like. We want to make sure the investments that were in the package for shovel-ready projects actually stay on pace. So my job is to make sure we can get the components implemented, because I think it focuses on public health with a balance with community safety in a way that if we can do it based on what the goals of the legislation were, I think it will help people and also keep our community safer.
So just real quick, when you say that you're going to be watching for disparities and monitoring, what actual power, given the fact that this is on local courts and all that, what power do you feel like you have as a governor to steer the ship if you see it going amiss?
Yeah, well, just to recall, when I was speaker, I was very active in some of the disparate impacts we would see with profiling and car stops and pedestrian stops. We have gotten better as a state at collecting data. So we want to make sure the Criminal Justice Commission can collect the data, and we will continue, honestly, to observe and see if there have to be any changes. I think it's important for Oregonians to know when a bill passes, it doesn't set in stone, right? There will be evolution of, does it need to be adjusted? Do we need different investments? My understanding is the Joint Committee for Legislature is going into the interim and into next year. You see it in some of the reports that have to come back. This is not a one and done conversation. This is, here's the next path. Can we implement it? And are people going to do what they say they were going to do? You know, we have counties saying they're voluntarily going to implement the deflection. Are they going to do it? Are they going to do it well? Do they have what they need? These are the types of things that as a state, we can dive deeper into local level issues and then be with them as a partner to say, okay, you need something else? Let's come into 25 and ask for whatever it is you're looking for. I think one of the biggest issues will be workforce. And that's something we're focusing on the behavioral health side, but also on the criminal justice side and public defense. We have to focus on the workforce of the individuals to make these things work. And so that's something we can bring to the conversation as a state as well.
I have a question from Carlos Fuentes with the Oregonian. Will the campaign finance laws potentially lead to more independent expenditures and overall less transparency in political contributions?
Well, to remind folks, the new limits, and it will take extensive changes in the reporting systems that we do currently have, and they'll go online, I believe, in 2027. There is a possibility about increased level of independent expenditures. And for the general public, that means organizations who come together on political activity that do not fall under traditional political action committees for candidates. It's what you see in other states. You see this activity in an independent fashion that is independent from the actual candidates themselves. I hope we can avoid that, but I do think we see that in other states, and it's something we have to continue to monitor, because that could create a dynamic that would leave money in the political campaigns, but in a way that could be somewhat a lot different than what we have now in Oregon. So it is a challenge and a possibility.
My question is back to the 4002. You said you intend to sign it, but you haven't signed it yet. Is there anything in the bill that would make you not sign it?
No, I will be signing it. What we're waiting for is, as you know from last year, I think it's important to have intent along with signing. So we're putting together assigning a letter to say this is what we believe our next steps. So we want to have that ready. And frankly, we're still waiting for the legislature to sign all the bills because we don't have them all yet. Session just ended last week. We don't have all the bills yet. So
let me ask you a question about next session, transportation. Senator Gorsuch said he welcomed your letter to the Transportation Commission because he said the pressures were, in his terms, insane. But some people are interpreting your letter as no tolling ever, and I know that's not what you said. And Senator Gorsuch and Representative McClain said they will need to consider that as an option if they're going to finance any of these projects that might be in the next transportation package, given that you have warned against the legislature raising fuel taxes and the truckers are already suing over the weight mile tax. Even though that ball is not yet in your court because the legislature hasn't met to discuss this, they are laying out a public process. So what's your stance on how future projects, there are always going to be future projects, how they're going to be financed?
Yep. So a number one topic for the 2025 session will be transportation funding. We do these things in 8-year cycles. The last one was 2017. It's now 2025. There will be a transportation package next year. There has to be. You're seeing the fact that ODOT, we needed extra money this session for them to do basic maintenance, shows you kind of the end of the last package. We need a new package around new resources and things like that. And the world has changed, right? So we have to talk about different ways to fund transportation. Certainly, the traditional gas tax is always part of it. Fees, for having a vehicle, but also we have to look at other things. That's why tolling was brought into this conversation in 2017. What my decision said is the process that was started in the 2017 legislature was not ready to go all the way through. That doesn't mean tolling in itself as a mechanism shouldn't be considered, but we got to this point where if we're going to spend more money to stand up the tolling infrastructure here in Oregon, we needed to have more certainty. And we were planning to spend a lot of money to do that. And frankly, I didn't think we knew we'd have the certainty to actually implement it. Now, the legislature needs to look at the different ways to fund transportation. I think you have to talk about all the sources, including tolling, to figure that out. But the legislature has to reset the conversation. The way it was set up for the metro area with the regional pricing project was not going to work. So they need to go back to the drawing table and say, is this part of the future conversation? And how do we get buy-in? And how do we address issues like diversion when tolling, if tolling is going to go into place? Things that were not addressed appropriately at this point. So I believe everybody wants safe, maintained roads. And I like to say, even if you move to a zero emission vehicle, which is better for the environment, we would like you to do that. That's a good thing to do. You still need a road to drive on. You still need a bridge to be up there if there's an earthquake, right? We have basic things we need to do in the state. And we have to make sure we have a funding foundation that can actually allow us to pay for it. So I will be starting the conversation with legislative leadership about what's your plan? What are you doing around transportation? This is going to be a topic for 2025. And that conversation starts now.
With the deflection programs, police officers can have some say in who gets deflection and who doesn't. How is that going to be handled? Are you recommending that police departments have a policy to address when they will give deflection and when they won't? When it comes to the state police,
well, certainly we'll be talking, the state police about how they're going to handle it. If we look back on Measure 1, I think one of the concerns that was raised is when that measure passed, there wasn't a lot of collaboration with law enforcement. I think what you're seeing here with 4002 is law enforcement and district attorneys have been involved in the conversation. My expectation is that there will be appropriate guidelines and training for law enforcement to understand what is now different, what that means for deflection. I would hope that DAs are making appropriate choices and we're going to have conversations with them. They have some discretion, but I think everybody, and what I heard through the public testimony is that everyone knows that it is up to the folks on the ground to make sure people have access to recovery. I heard that loud and clear. I believe that's what DAs want. I believe that's what law enforcement wants. And so what can we do as a state to help the training and the technical assistance so they know what it means on the ground? Because that did not happen under Measure 110, and I think that's why you didn't see the violation pathway working as well as it could have.
Requirement versus expectation are very different things. And when you're giving, the opportunity to officers to say, no, I don't want to give you this stuff, also
and we want to track that data and make sure that that is not happening. And I think the best way to do that is to make sure people are trained, they understand expectations. And I will say for the counties, and again, this is at the local level, the state will be spending a lot more time with our local partners to say, we are watching, we have expectations about the money you're receiving, and we want to see particular outcomes on what you're doing with the resources. And that is a lever that we can play at the state level. Well, we will be from the different agencies, whether, I'm working with the Chief Justice in the courts, working with our Criminal Justice Commission. We're going to put all tools we can to make sure we have a different relationship with our county partners to make sure this is happening well. Not yet, but we will be having that conversation with our experts here at the state. I do believe that when we, again, going back to the work that we did a few years ago about pedestrian stops and car stops, we have seen improved numbers because I do think there has been different training at the department that does the training for law enforcement. We need to do continuing education. That is something we want to add to this mix. And I'd just be clear, we might not have all the resources. This might be a 2025 conversation for additional resources. We're going to take this 1 month at a time, making sure we can set up by September the pathways to deflection that are required in the bill.
Yeah, a question from Dick Hughes. Why wait a week for a press conference about the legislature ending?
Well, didn't they finish late on Thursday night? And then I thought they were going to Friday, and no reason other than you're all rested and maybe have better questions today. That was it. Although I heard they talked to you late into the night on Thursday, so God bless you. That wasn't me. So.
Yeah, Governor. I'm looking at deflection. You've got 23 counties that said we'll do it, 13 that don't. So when we're talking about consistency, do you have any concerns about the 13 that don't, and how can that really be a consistent system when some counties have it and others don't?
I think this will be a transition for our more rural counties. And again, what I was told is, even though some counties did not sign on to say that they would voluntarily participate, I think that was a timing issue for some. They had to have actual local conversations about that. Others were more prepared to get in when they were asked. The size of the county matters, the resources matter. Do we need to take more of a regional approach so they can participate? So those are some of the questions I think we have to go back and talk to those counties and say, what do you do? What do you need? There will be a bit of a transition, but our largest counties are in terms of voluntary deflection.
Yeah, and then going back to the topic of education, you mentioned some of the work that came this session around the dashboard on budget transparency following the Portland strike. And I'm just kind of curious, Salem Kaiser, April 1st might be seeing a similar strike too, but on looking ahead at the 2025 session, what the conversations have maybe looked like on surrounding school funding and, what you're hoping to maybe see as schools try to continue in it.
We've already begun that work, legislators and other education partners, about the modernizing of the current service level calculation to make sure that what we believe are the basic needs of districts actually meet their financial needs. And I think there's been a bit of a disconnect, and that came up in the PPS strike conversation. So those things are starting. There'll be some work groups. There's other groups looking at the connection between funding and outcomes. So there's going to be a lot of work in the interim that we will be having an oversight role on and a coordinating role on. As it relates to Salem Kaiser, I hope that they continue to stay at the table to try to avoid a strike. That's in the best interest of the students. I know they just settled their classified staff contract. Good leaders in the district. I think they're really trying to get it done, and I hope they can. But the 25 conversation is about, do we have the right calculations for our districts? Because I think what you're hearing now is there's a real disconnect between what we think is base funding for our schools and what they need to operate. And we need to fix that formula if it's not right.
You said it yourself, you think that people boring and you really feel like it's paying it. But also that the state really did a job of
I know that, Measure 110 funded groups really still feel like OHA hasn't fully supported them in standing up their recovery, offerings. So what are you going to do to make sure that they still feel like they're supported, the cannabis dollars that they're getting, make sure that they can rapidly expand access to care, while also having this impending deadline of September 1st? Clear, specific.
Yep. Thank you. Well, first of all, I don't think it's all up to the providers who are getting the marijuana resources through Measure 110 to solve all of this. This is a much broader conversation about our complete system of recovery services. For example, there's $18 million in the housing bill for recovery homes. We're talking about new treatment facilities, and there's a whole host of them, some culturally specific, very impressive, specific investments on treatment. As it relates to the operation at OHA, I've been very clear with the agency. I read the audit from the Secretary of State. We need to be more intentional about how the money that's going out through the networks, the behavioral health resource networks, the burns through the Measure 110, that they understand what their goals are, they understand what the outcomes that are expected. This is probably getting too much in the weed, but when Measure 110 was passed, marijuana revenue was seen to be going like through the sky. It's not doing that anymore, right? So it's going to be more on a flat kind of trajectory. So making sure that the things that have been stood up in this biennium for those dollars actually can continue. So that's a question we're engaging with the health authority. We need a new director there. We don't have one yet. So we are really making sure that the funding side of the marijuana dollars that's going out through our community partners is going to be improved and support them to do their work, because it is a critical resource that was an upside of Measure 10, that these dollars are going to continue to go forward. Can they be effective? Can they be integrated with the rest of the investments we're making? Because our job is to have a system that works for everyone. So if you're a person who's suffering from an addiction, that you know where to go, you will feel supported. If you need culturally specific care, you will get it. And all these pieces have to come together. And that is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about with my team, that there is integration and there is an actual system where the investments that we have produce the outcomes we want.
Two quick things that have caused some heartburn coming out of the session are the fact that Dems opted to leave Senator Frederick's book bill on the table. I think they feel usually upset about that. A number of advocacy groups said you just hung out until Saturday and voted on the bill. I'm interested in your take on that. I'm also interested in some of the angst over spending money on, for instance, $15 million for the hops in the budget bill, as opposed to $15 million more for housing, $15 million more for treatment. I mean, are you planning any budget vetoes at this point? What do you make of both those things?
Well, that's a lot. So having been through a couple short sessions myself, the things that didn't get done were pretty few, just to start off. I do believe we should have passed the book ban bill. I don't know what the dynamic was at the end of session. I think we can still maintain local control and not discriminate on the choices made in our school libraries. So I assume we'll be back on that conversation. As it relates to how things were funded and what was funded, the legislature gets to make those choices. As governor, my job is to look at all those and say, what's our due diligence? Can we say that the money that is out there will be spent in that particular way? I think the sports investments were seen as, from their point of view, economic development issues. But I will talk about, I just want to point out, there were 44 projects in the infrastructure direct allocations for housing, 44 projects, $94 million. So we're looking at all those projects. We weren't involved in any of those dedicated dollars. I think the bulk of those are specific. Communities have said, if you give us this, we're going to build this. That's good. I want to make sure that's the case and be very clear with those communities that the expectation is, if you're getting money for water or sewer, that there are going to be houses down the line, not 10 years, in the next 3 to 5 or the next 2. And those are the kind of questions we're asking before we finalize what we do with those bills. At this point, I'm reviewing everything. I never say no. I don't have anything planned at this point. So.
$65 million for shelter operation. But what do you do at this point with the housing agency, making sure that those contracts that they're establishing for the first time directly with developers are, holding them accountable to the spending? How do you look at the differential cost between one shelter and another? Are we really using that money in the best, most efficient way, or putting people up in hotels?
I feel like you should be in my meetings with me because we're having these exact conversations like almost every week. It is a change in practice for the state to be having some of these direct contracts for shelter providers. That's not how it's normally been done. So we're being very clear about trying to get a sense of what is an appropriate level of cost to operate shelters, not to make it difficult, but getting some line of sight of what the operational costs are. Because at the end of this biennium, for me, the goal is to say, we understand the shelter system much better than we did 2 years ago. We understand what it costs to maintain it. We understand what the expenditures are, what people need to be paid, what it costs to actually operate. Because we're going to be coming back in 25 and saying, we still need this shelter capacity. We understand how it's being spent. We understand the outcomes. We are tracking the data differently. Because it's a big investment to continue to do this. We're not going to solve our homelessness crisis in 2 years. We need this system to be out there for the next couple, and we want to make sure it's doing everything it can to be accountable and effective. And that's something we as a state will be doing differently in coming forward. Well, the most cost-effective thing we can do is prevention. I mean, I got to be really upfront. So I'm glad we have additional prevention dollars from the legislature. That is the cheapest thing to do. Keep people housed and where they are before they become unsheltered. We do want to be asking the questions because sometimes it is more cost-effective, to do one-offs and put somebody in a motel. I'm also a big fan of Project Turnkey. You know that. When we buy motel sites, the communities buy motel sites that can be easily renovated for shelters and where you can bring services to. They've had a lot of success. So I feel good about where Project Turnkey site projects are. But getting some systemization across the state around what it means to be a shelter operator is new for our state. And it's something that we're bringing to this so we can manage to a very difficult crisis in a better way.
Yeah, Governor, I talked to some residential addiction providers who say that they've had trouble accessing Kotek funding from the 2023 allocation. So, any thoughts on what the state can do this year?
We have been asking the agency, what is still left? What is in the pipeline? What are you planning to fund? What are the holdups? In some cases, the holdup is on the recipient's end. Some of it's on the agency end, but it doesn't matter to me. I just want to make sure that we can get resources out the door so things can get built, whether it's new or renovation. And I think that's why you see some of the things that legislature did on the direct project allocations that they did. But it's not going to be any different from my point of view. Let's talk about Multnomah County. Multnomah County is set to have $25 million going to Multnomah County for their sobering center that they see as kind of the linchpin of their service delivery system. I want to know how that money's being spent. I want to know when. I want to know what they're doing first. I want to know where the location is. That's the kind of questions we're going to be asking everyone. So we can say with certainty, we know you're doing what you're supposed to be doing with those dollars, and we're going to see the results. That is a increased role for the state. Sometimes we've been like, we'll just send you the money and not say anything. Those days are over. I want to know exactly what you're doing with the money, and I'll make sure it's serving your community.
I want to follow up on your response to the 44 projects that are getting 94 million directly. I think they come off a list of more than 200. I think some legislators say they want to apply the same plan for housing. Is there a way we can do that administratively, or is that going to take further legislative action for the rest of those projects or any new ones that are proposed?
So we're looking at what it means to do a direct allocation like that. How much oversight we can have when the dollars go out. The money is going to be going, most of it, through Business Oregon, and they're deciding whether they put the money up front or it's going to be on a reimbursement-based model. What we're doing right now is we will be connecting with all 44 of those project recipients and say, can you give us a little bit more info? I will say that the legislators did score all the projects. They had a scoring system to try to, go through all the asks. I do think at the end of the day, the preference from my point of view is what I had in my bill, which was an infrastructure program that was more that was there on an ongoing basis kind of like what we do with the Special Public Works Fund, where everybody knows it's there, they know what the parameters are, they apply for the money. I'm not saying it was wrong that we didn't do that this session, but I do think going forward, we're going to be in these infrastructure conversations for a while. Here's my biggest concern about direct allocations. I think there's a fairness and equity issue. If you're a community that needs something and you somehow didn't hear that you needed to get your thing in, or your legislator wasn't, you know, on the stick and didn't get their application in or their information into legislative leadership, you get left out. I want to make sure there's a fair process going forward that everybody can apply to. But in the meantime, these 44 projects were dedicated by the legislature. I just want to make sure they're going to build housing. I will say, I thought House Bill 4134, which was another bill that had they had very specific criteria, and you could see exactly what homes they were going to build. I want to see that kind of information for the other projects as well. Yes. Well, again, going back to 2017, when the prices for these projects were projected, they were very different than where they are today. Some of that supply chain, some of that, I mean, there's a whole lot of factors, right? So the Rose Quarter in particular got a lot more expensive. So did the Abernathy Bridge changes. I will say, had a lovely conversation or a phone call from Secretary Buttigieg to have the $450 million coming to help with the lid at the Rose Quarter that is a significant investment for us to do the project in the Rose Quarter, not only the traffic improvements, but also the lid. That was really critical for us. The legislature, one of my priorities for 2025 is that the funding that they can pass will actually follow through on the commitments we made 8 years ago. Rose Quarter, Abernathy Bridge. I want to be really clear with legislators. We have to do the basics and commit the projects that are in the queue before we start new projects. And so they're going to have to figure out how to fund those things first before we talk about any new projects. And that's Rose Quarter. That's Abernathy. Abernathy will be done, but with our other things on 205, there are other things in the metro area, and there are other projects around the state that we've committed to. They have to get funded and done before we start anything new. Plus, we have to have basic maintenance and all those kinds of things as well. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the week.